I'm Aryeh Schwartz along with Eli Horowitz. Welcome to the WNBA Insider Podcast, a 6-week deep dive into each team of the WNBA. This week, we got the Storm and the Mercury. Eli, say hi to the folks.
What's up?
Real quickly, a free agency update. Not much has happened, guys. I'm going to keep it real. Cappy signed with LA. We'll talk about that when we get back to LA. There's some cool implications there, but I don't really think that that's a shocker or a game changer. Chicago similarly made a few signings. Nothing big there. Let's start with the Storm. This is a young team. A lot of people had high expectations for them, last year. And now that they should be competing for a middle spot, considering after the coaching change midseason, they were able to make a late season push and make it into the playoffs. So the real questions: can Lloyd, Stewie, and Bird really bring this team to a top level? They've added basically one player in the offseason, re-signed some people, but they lost their best defender from last year in Ramu Takashi. Hope I got that name right. Eli, looking at the stats, we've been chatting about what this team can kind of do better. Their biggest weakness last year was their defense. Looking at that with a young team that, has a really skilled player in Stewie, and then they have that vet-savvy, person with Bird. You got Lloyd, who can really run around. I know you got some takes on her that a lot of people aren't willing to say. Let's get your toes wet. Let me hear what you think about the Storm.
Well, I see the Seattle Storm's biggest weakness is their perimeter defense. So specifically, Jewel Lloyd and Sue Bird. If we look at the pick and roll, defending the pick and roll, Jewel Lloyd is 20th percentile below average, and Sue Bird was 30th percentile below average. And it's a big problem when your two starting guards get eaten alive in the pick and roll. And diving into the film, they did a little bit of both. They'd go over screens, they'd go under screens. But the biggest problem I saw was they would just die on screens. And so then you're putting Breanna Stewart or Crystal Langhorne in a 2-on-1 situation where you have a guard attacking them and a big man rolling or popping out, with Lloyd and Bird just out of the equation, just getting hit by the screen and not able to recover over or under. And so I'm concerned because I feel like regardless of who's the coach, that's going to be an issue if you have a weak point of attack defense.
Yeah, you can definitely give some insight on this. I think something that could be positive with them is pushing the pace a little bit. Playing not necessarily full court press, but, something that's going to take advantage of, or not take advantage, but kind of reduce the advantage of having such size on them, on weak defense on them. So, maybe you get those two perimeter protectors to be pushing it. The second they cross half court, you're up in their face, trying to get a few more transition balls. I know having we've spoken about this. Transition ball was their best aspect of defense, correct?
Yeah.
But something that was their weakness on offense was transition ball, because you have someone like you said, or like you've told me, Sue Bird, getting up there in age, isn't as mobile as she used to be. You have a very powerful offensive team that their biggest weakness was their defense and their inability to just stop the bleeding from other teams. Like they could put up points, but if someone was going to lock them down on defense, they're still the score is going to get run up and they couldn't handle the shootout, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And, I actually like Langhorne and Stewart as like a defensive front court. It's not the biggest in the league, but they're active, they're mobile. They're adding Courtney Paris to the mix, who is not mobile, but, I think Langhorne and Stewart are mobile enough where Paris, I guess, gives a bit of a different look. At minimum, she can come in and at least be a body, somebody who can pick up fouls, play some minutes. But again, it's just, if Lloyd and Bird are going to be attacked in the pick and roll consistently, this team is going to have problems defending. They're going to have to figure out a scheme that hides it. I don't think we talk enough about that in the WNBA. Again, not to compare to the NBA, but we talk about some smaller guards sometimes, like an Isaiah Thomas, where it's not even a matter of effort. They're just small. And when I look at the Storm's backcourt, it feels like everyone's playing a position down, if that makes sense. Like Jewel Lloyd is more the size of a 1, but is playing the 2 because they have Sue Bird. Clark, she's kind of playing the 3, a little 4, but she's not that big herself. Like in some ways, she's more of a 2. So I think they're just really small defensively on the perimeter. And looking at their roster, I just really don't see how they're going to change that significantly.
Yeah, I mean, I think something that could help them is doing a little bit of subbing, players that are going to be defensive specialists to get them in there. Because if you're looking at their bench, I mean, overall, if you want to look for players to fill their deficiencies, right? And I'm just looking at offensively, you have bench players that can come in and still produce offensively. Now, I'm not suggesting something crazy, bench Sue Bird or don't play Jewel Lloyd, because I think that's not even an option considering who the team is and their identity and just what those players mean to the team and how they work. But there are some players that need to get some other minutes. Alexis Peterson, she's a rookie, horrible offensive season last year, but get some other players in there, get Wickham some time out there. Alicia Clark can also definitely produce offensively. She's kind of weak defensively also, but there's different players that are going to give you different positives, and I think you need to try and find a kind of one way that works. Something that's going to make, okay, this is our defensive lineup. I know when we're bleeding and we need to throw something together to just stop them and get the ball rolling our way, that these people can do that. Is there anybody who defensively really stands out? I know you're big on a few players like Noelle Quinn. Alexis Peterson had an amazing defensive season last year. Is there anybody who stands out to you for somebody to watch on this team?
I mean, obviously, Breanna Stewart, I think she's going to continue to get better. I think she can guard centers or 4s and even switch out on the perimeter. And I think maybe that's something they can look at. Now, I don't think they can switch very much because, again, Bird and Lloyd are so small, but maybe, late in a shot clock, if a team's going to run pick and roll and there's only 4 or 5 seconds left on the shot clock, maybe you have Langhorne and Stewart just switch out onto those guards and just make it a little bit more difficult in a short shot clock situation. But just watching the film, I got to be honest. I mean, Bird and Lloyd are just dying on screens completely. I mean, completely, and again, there's no scheme that can fix that. If you switch, now how are they going to guard, bigs? If you go over, you're just dead on the screen. If you go under, the guard's just going to pull up and shoot a 3. Now, maybe going under is the best scheme for them because it's going to force teams to have to shoot 3s, which I personally as a coach don't like, but maybe against certain teams and certain players, maybe against Alasia Clarendon, for example, you just go under and make her shoot. Maybe that's something that would hide some of the deficiencies of their backcourt defense.
Well, so I'm looking at this and I'm thinking to myself, how can, you were talking about Stewie growing, and I agree that she's definitely going to grow. This is her 3rd or 4th season. So she's definitely got more upside. She hasn't reached her full potential. She's going to be a dominant force in this league for years to come. Something that I'm thinking is, all right, you got a new coach. How can you create a game plan that's really going to be catered to Stewie's needs? And something we've discussed is, she has a unique ability. She's a very skilled defender who, like you said, you feel could play the 5 and take on centers in this league because, yes, she might not be as strong or have the same size, but she's savvy enough on defense to make some educated and some positive plays that will kind of cover that up. But she can also run out to cover, other areas of the court that most centers can't. So what can the Storm do as far as game planning to properly use Breanna Stewart? Because if she's playing as the 4 versus playing as the center, or you have someone like Crystal Langhorne who maybe on the way they're playing, Langhorne's the forward and Stewie's the center, but the other team they're playing defensively can just say, no, we're going to put our forward on Stewie because she's more mobile. You want to force Stewie to be covered by the center so that you can kind of draw her out and force her out of her comfort of the paint.
Yeah, it's an interesting conundrum because Langhorne had a really productive season and she's really efficient offensive player, but she doesn't, she's more in the paint And so, one thing like we've talked about in other podcasts is the ability to put Stewart at the 5 around shooters and really spread the floor. But then Langhorne is kind of clogging up some space. But Langhorne is really efficient. So they kind of need her out there. What I think is I would really try to run a lot of the offense through Stewart, use her more at the elbows. Let Langhorne post up, get the ball to Stewart at the elbows because she's such a great passer. And the thing is, Sue Bird, as she's 39% from 3. So I think they need to, what I would do is kind of take some of that ball handling load off of Sue Bird and hand it to Stewart, not as a ball handler, but as a facilitator. And what I mean by that is, Bird can bring the ball up, throw it into Stewart at the elbow, and then Bird can run into the corner and be kind of a shooter, right? She can be a spot shooter, and that will also kind of take some of the burden off Bird. And then maybe on the defensive end, she has a little bit more effort. So I think they should, really give Stewart a lot more responsibility just to run the offense as a passer at the elbows, even popping out to the 3-point line. She shot 37% from 3. She can attack the basket. She's a matchup nightmare. So she, to me, is the hardest player to guard on this team. Jewel Lloyd, in terms of a one-on-one, yes, Lloyd is a very good one-on-one isolation scorer, but she's also a bit predictable in what she's going to do. Stewart is just so versatile. I don't think there's a lot of players that can really guard her. So to me, she would be the complete focal point of the offense. I would make Sue Bird start to transition to a spot-up shooter role. And really, if like with Phoenix, Tarazi's really done that a lot too, right? Like she'll bring up the ball, but a lot of the game you'll see Leilani Mitchell bring up the ball or Robinson bring up the ball, and they'll use Tarazi almost as a 2-guard. So I think you could get some good mileage out of Sue Bird as a shooter, run the offense through Stewart, do some high-low with Langhorne, then let Lloyd get her touches kind of in a Kyrie Irving type of role to get hers and really attack the basket and kick to shooters. And then Alicia Clark, that's interesting. She's more of a mid-range. I think Alicia Clark needs to work on her 3-point shot a little bit. She was at 33%. If she can get that up 2, 3, 4 percentages and stop taking so many mid-ranges, it's really going to help this team.
Well,
sorry,
let me just ask.
I know I just said a lot there.
No. I'm loving it. I just want to ask you: is this the year of Stewie?
The reason I just word vomited about the offense is, I'll be honest. When I look at the defense, I just don't. Other than just more effort, I don't see how it's going to improve. Like I don't look at this. I don't think this team is going to be an elite defensive team. So I think their best shot is to just really maximize their offense. So if they were 4th in offense rating last year, they need to be 2nd. If this is a top 2 offense, and then maybe they can get their defense from 9th to 6th or to 7th. I think that's going to be the more realistic formula for this team to be a threat, is to have a league average defense, but like a top 2 offense.
Well, that's what I was going to say. First of all, I wanted to ask you if you think this is the year of Stewie. Is this the year she takes over Seattle and, just takes the throne from Sue Bird and kind of comes into her own?
She's their best player, in my opinion. Is that a hot take?
I don't think it's necessarily a hot take. I think people kind of want to treat her with kid gloves and say that, she's still got time to grow because you have a Sue Bird, because you have a young player in Jewel Lloyd. But I agree with you, and I think that it's something that needs to be said, which is this has to be the year of Stewie. If this team wants to be better, it can no longer be, we're splitting the load for her so that, this team, she can properly grow or whatever. At a certain point, step into your own. And this needs to be her year, if you're asking me.
I don't know. If you ask me, their best 2 players are Stewart and Lloyd, and that's no disrespect to Sue Bird. She's had a much better career and is one of the best players in league history. But I'm saying right now in 2018, this needs to be Stewart's team followed by Lloyd.
100%. And I couldn't
Bird
agree.
Can still have a good role because she's such a great shooter.
Well, exactly. There's ways to still use her as she's, on the descent of her career. And that's not a bad thing. It's just like using her it's just like role players. You use them in a specific way, and that's what you need to do with players like Diana Taurasi and Sue Bird. And that's what the Lynx have been able to do, and that's what the Sparks have been able to do. And that's what good teams do if you want to prolong the careers of players that can have an extremely positive impact on the court.
Yeah. I mean, the other good news is they have the 5th pick in the draft. So they're going to get an impact player. So that's another factor that, I think depth is an issue with this team. Like we said, they don't have a lot of good defensive players. I think maximizing their offense is the way to go, but they're going to get an impact player. So I wanted to ask you, looking at their roster, they have a pretty set starting 5, right? And then they have Courtney Paris, who's going to be a body off the bench. They have Peterson. They have Whitcomb. That's an 8. They have Mosqueda Lewis, who's a liability defensively, but, she can play 10 to 15 minutes and shoot. What do they need to address here with that 5th pick? Because they might be able to get like a franchise type of player, frankly. That's how good this draft is if you're picking in the top 6 or 7.
It's an interesting conundrum because I think, often in the WNBA, you don't necessarily see yourself drafting somebody who, especially these days, because of the level of the college basketball players and the top picks in the draft, Asia Wilson's going to make an immediate impact. Kia Nurse, she can make an immediate impact. There's so many players who are projected or are top in there, and they're projected to go first. So if I'm a WNBA team, I think often you don't think, okay, could I draft this top tier talent and have her not be a starter this year? And even if she blows me away in training camp, have her not be a starter. And that's kind of what I'm thinking about as far as with the Storm, because I think, all right, part of me wants to say you draft someone who's just a lockdown, energetic defender. Now, an Elena Beard style defender, someone who can lock down and lock into somebody who's a top tier player. But I also want someone who can shoot. You never want to say they're a singular player. But in my mind, I'm looking for someone to either say fill in for Sue Bird or fill in for Jewell Loyd, and Jewell Loyd shifts over to fill in for Sue Bird.
Well, that's what I'm looking at. That's what
I
wanted to ask you, and that's, I think, a big question. Should they be drafting a point guard that's kind of going to be taken over for Sue Bird? Or should this team say, look, Jewell Loyd was a point guard in college, right? And she's not very big. And that's what I think, that's my issue. She really, Jewell Loyd ideally needs to be guarding other point guards because she's of her size. But with Sue Bird there, she kind of has to guard twos. And so another option would then be drafting a bigger guard with the idea that you would shift Jewell Loyd over to the 1 eventually and then draft a bigger guard.
That's what you need to do, though, I think, because in my opinion, I haven't spoken with the past Seattle coaching staffs. But in my opinion, I think the reason, that kind of was the idea. Jewell Loyd was going to be that person to replace Sue Bird, to come in when Sue Bird needs to rest and be that change of pace back, if you will. But because when she got out there, she made a name for herself. She was lights out. She was tearing it up here and there. It became a thing where they just needed to play both of them. And I do commend, the staff for playing both of them, but I think a lot of people overlook the deficiencies that she had on defense, and that being a huge aspect of why this team struggled in many ways. If you're asking me, if I'm the GM, if I'm the coach, and I'm saying, all right, I know I have Jewell Loyd, who's this young firecracker, can really do stuff, and then I have Sue Bird, who's kind of, I don't want to say on her way out, but she's on her way out, sorry. I'm thinking in my mind, I want someone who this year is going to be an off the bench, change of pace, somebody, a bigger guard who can fill that 2 role. And maybe if I want to play a smaller lineup even, right, while I have Sue Bird, she can play the 3.
Now there's other people, I'm looking at the Summit's mock draft and USA Today and others. And, there's some people saying they need to draft a center because Crystal Langhorne is only 6'2". And I really like Langhorne. I think, she's able to hold her own and especially is an efficient offensively, but she can't guard Brittany Griner, who's 6'8". It's very difficult to guard Tina Charles, Jonquel. She's just undersized at the 5. And Stewart has the savvy and athleticism to guard those players, but she's also going to get pushed around and get in foul trouble. And Courtney Paris if she's coming off the bench, I can live with it, but she's not a solution to start at center. So there's some people saying they need to draft a true center who can go in there, start next to Stewart, and who can actually bang with Griner and Fowles and Parker and NECA. Then you could bring Langhorne and Paris off the bench, and Stewart wouldn't. Stewart, like the way I look at it is Stewart. If you're in a playoff game and Stewart's just like, you need to put Stewart on Griner, or you need to put her on Fowles because she's moving her feet the best, you do it. But over the course of 34 regular season games, I wouldn't want Stewart to have to pick up fouls and have that responsibility. And so there's some people saying that with the 5th pick, they should be looking at a center, and there's some good ones. The center from Mississippi State, and they're, number 2 in the nation right now, Tierra McCowan.
Well,
then you have the center from Russia, who's supposed to be a project, but some people have her, like DraftSite.com has her second, Maria Vadiva, who's the kind of center from Russia, who people are saying are a bit more of a project. But McCowan's 6'7", and they just don't have someone. Mercedes Russell of Tennessee is 6'6". Asia Wilson obviously won't fall there, but she's 6'5". So I'm just trying to give you context to say, like, Langhorne's 6'2", and that's just, it long term, she really is a 4.
Yeah. Well, answer me this. I mean, I think this team has the ability to be running all over the place, and with who they have, they could really do that. You're lacking without having Takashi. Okay, fine. They did add somebody in Natasha Howard over the offseason, and just, I want you to close your eyes and think about this. Brianna Stewart at the 5, Natasha Howard at the 4, or even vice versa. Running that is a slightly smaller lineup. Natasha Howard isn't, a speedster down the court, but she's definitely mobile enough and athletic enough to be a flex and to really give this team a smaller lineup that has some ability to do some stuff. She can get some rebounds. Her stats last year weren't the greatest, but I think that had a lot to do with her role that she took on the Lynx. But I think she has a lot of positives for this style of team. That's why I think it was a really good signing by Seattle. I know you probably disagree. You're not the biggest Natasha Howard fan.
No,
what are your thoughts though? About
I think it is a good signing because she's 6'4" and athletic, and I think her and Stewart could be very interesting defensive combo because they're so mobile, and that's a team that could really cause some problems. But again, like, not big enough to handle some of the biggest in the league, and to rely on Langhorne, and Langhorne is just not tall enough at times, and Paris is not mobile enough. So that would be the argument of drafting someone like, McCowan, who's 6'7", and it just can be that true traditional center, or Maria Vadiva, who's 6'7", and can really just do that. But, having said that, like, there might be a guard like Kelsey Mitchell available at 5, Jordan Canada of UCLA, Lexi Brown of Duke. They're going to be there, and those are game-changing guards. Lexi Brown is a 5'9" point guard. So I don't know.
Well, answer me this. Obviously,
they have cornerstone pieces in Stewart and Lloyd, but they're missing some depth at critical positions, and it's still yet to be determined if Stewart and Lloyd ceiling is high enough to be like true title contenders, or do they need to be like your second and third best players?
Well, that's why I wanted to ask you this, which is, well, first of all, I'm going to disagree. I think Stewie could be that face, but they've just been kind of babying her because of who else is on the team. But I think start thinking about trades maybe. Obviously, it's the WNBA. There's not a lot of trades or whatever. But if I'm Seattle and I see, okay, trade back into the second round to get even earlier, I mean, possibly at that point, you take your first pick, you get a bigger guard who can really have an impact right away. And then with your second pick, you move in looking for a true center, someone who's a project.
Yeah, I'm going to disagree. I think the 5th pick in this draft, you hold on.
Oh, I'm not saying trade the
if
fifth
anything,
pick. I'm saying
if anything,
I'm saying
I would be offering the 5th pick and their 2nd round pick to Indiana for the 2nd pick. No, I don't think they'll do that, but
I mean, Indy would never do that. I'm not saying trade the 5th pick. I don't think you can do that with how deep this draft is, because you can decide. I'd rather be in a situation where I can decide I'm going to pick up, because I mean, I don't think it's a crazy idea that they're looking at their 2 biggest weaknesses, a true center, which people hope they could get from Swords last year, or to get a guard that can really man up on some of the bigger guards in the league and have a defensive presence.
right.
So, but if I'm them, 5th pick, you're probably not going bad. You can sink your teeth into filling one of those holes.
Yeah. For me, it comes down to you take a point guard or you take a center. I think they have really good, Clark, Langhorne, Stewart, Lloyd, Whitcomb, Peterson. I think they're pretty set on the wings. They need one more big. Howard and Paris are solid pieces off the bench, but long-term to have like a starting level center or one more guard who you feel like can play next to Lloyd, but defense has to be a top priority there. So they have a lot to think about. This is not going to be easy. USA Today has them taking Lexi Brown. I've tweeted about her. She's one of my favorite guards in this draft, but she's a point guard. So again, defensively, how does that work with Lloyd? But we'll see.
Yeah. Now's the time of the segment when we're talking about Seattle Storm that we're going to break down into a fan question. And I think this comes from Matthew Hallett. I'm probably getting it wrong. Merv Sports. He does some great coverage of women's basketball, WNBA. I know he's a huge fan, but he's also the Australian League. He's a big fan over there. What he tweeted at us: will Sammy Whitcomb be given the freedom to develop into a consistent bench piece the Storm crave? She has the shooting and the defense. She's played very well for the Perth Lynx. What are your thoughts? Now, I don't think either of us can necessarily jump into will she be given the freedom, because we don't know the style or what head coach has seen yet. So having a new coach, I think it's much more of is she the type of player that could, being a consistent bench piece, fill that need for this team? Because they definitely have that. I saw some good things looking at the stats and what she's done, what she was able to do last year, and looking at the stats. I wouldn't be surprised. I'm a huge fan of hers, but I think when you have a team like this, the question is, can she step up being in a role that she's going to fight for minutes? She's a guard forward, so, or at least that's how they describe her. She's 5'10". Can she be a flex? Can she be a bigger guard for when the team needs her? Or can she run it and push it on a smaller lineup as a forward? What are your thoughts?
I think it never hurts to have shooting. She was 33% on threes last year. So I think she's someone who deserves to get minutes for shooting. But I feel like, they also have Mosqueda Lewis kind of in that role, and both of them have some question marks on the defensive end. So I think, again, that's kind of my take. I'll leave it at that on that one. I don't really have more to add. I think she should get 10 minutes a game, but I think with Mosqueda Lewis there too, there's almost only they're kind of a redundant role, especially if neither of them are elite defensive players. That's my take.
I hear it. So answer me this: Brandon Stewart's not on the team. 2018 season is done. Who was the MVP, excluding Brandon Stewart? I mean, obviously she's on the team, but we've said we think she needs to be the MVP for this team to take a jump. Who would be your MVP for this team besides Stewie?
From last year?
Who needs to be the number one? No, the roster that we have now, obviously we can't talk about.
This team needs to, like we said, this year needs to be transitioning some of the responsibilities from Sue Bird onto Lloyd and Stewart. And like I said, Stewart can actually take on some of the point guard responsibilities as a passing facilitator from the elbows, This draft, though, I will say this is a team to watch in the draft. What they do in the draft could have really big consequences because they might, if they go the guard route with Alexi Brown, it could be, a very savvy move in that she could develop under Sue Bird, but then their lack of size could really hurt them, or vice versa. Maybe they take a big who's a project, but then they lose the opportunity to have Sue Bird mentor a young point guard. So I think that my biggest takeaway before we move on to Phoenix is this team needs to decide long term, is Jewell Loyd a scorer or can she be a point guard? And I think if the answer is they look at her as a scorer, I think I would take Lexi Brown or a point guard. I think having Bird there is just too invaluable. If you can get like a point guard of the future, I think you do it. I think Howard, Paris, Stewart, and Langhorne, it's good enough. They can get by there, in terms of their front court. They do need a center. I'm not saying they don't, but I'm tending to lead towards developing a guard with a few years left in Sue Bird's career. Unless, like I said, as an organization, they say, no, Jewell Loyd can move to the 1 when she retires. Then I say take a center. So does that kind of make sense? They need to answer that question first.
Yeah, and just, thinking about it out loud from the way you broke it down there, I think you have to take advantage of having Sue Bird on the back end of her career. And, maybe you try and pull her in. I don't know if she's spoken about whether or not she'd want to be a coach, but you can use that. That's something that they have to take advantage of. Do you really want to have one rookie, super young project at center and Stewie? Is Stewie ready to, take on that big of a role where she's, helping that person next to her also? Or do you want to draft someone who can be helped by Sue? And obviously that comes with deciding about Jewell Loyd, but I think we've laid it out pretty clear. If I'm there, we're not in that position of power, but if I'm in that position of power, I'm saying Loyd's coming in after Sue, and Sue can mentor her, but Sue also can mentor another young guard. That's just two birds, one stone. I don't see why you don't do it, and that's pun intended.
Yeah, the more we talk about it, again, if McCowan continues to just amaze for Mississippi State, she's 6'7", so it's going to be a tough call. And the Maria Vadiva as a project is going to be a tough call. But, I do think long-term, like Stewart is going to be the anchor of the front court. And I feel like it's easy to, you can find decent centers, in the free agent market who can kind of play alongside Stewart. So to get a point guard for the future would just be Lexi Brown would be so critical. And I mean, Loyd has kind of really turned into a scorer now. So I mean, can she go back to that more facilitator role she played in college? I don't know. It'd be tough, especially when you see how well she can attack the rim and play in isolation.
Well, yeah, and you said this earlier, and I was definitely thinking it, and I think it speaks volumes. This team has the ability to do a lot, if we're looking at this upcoming year based off who they have, a lot of things offensively and a lot of fun formations to make them attack. But can they push themselves from a bottom-of-the-league defensive team to a middle-of-the-pack defensive team to give their offense a chance to finally actually, live up to higher potential and put them in a more secure spot in the playoffs versus the last couple of weeks and basically needing to win out so that you can make it.
Yeah, we're 33 minutes in and we haven't even talked about Dan Hughes and that hire.
A lot of mixed. We're not going to get into that now. I want to see, what he does in the draft and kind of get some more insight from him. I know there are some interviews with him I heard are going to be coming out soon. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about him. And kind of next time we cover this team, I think we're going to have to do a deep dive into his philosophy and whether or not we're trying to, fit wrong shapes into wrong holes right here.
Yeah, and I think we both expressed some skepticism about the hire, but I think we pride ourselves on analyzing the game and what we see. And so I think it'd be unfair to judge him as the coach of the Storm until we actually see them play. He had success as a coach. He's one of the, he's the winningest coach in Stars history, took them to the finals, never did win a ring there, but he does have an overall losing record for his career. And there's some, rationale for that with rebuilds and stuff. So, I think it was a meh hire because my philosophy is more to give a younger person a chance, especially give a female, a person of color. I mean, just to see a white male who's kind of had their opportunity get another chance, it's just not my favorite. It's nothing personal to Dan Hughes, just philosophically, but I think we owe him a chance before we start saying, oh, it was a terrible hire. Let's see what they do on the court.
Oh, 100%. Completely with that. So, guys, remember, tune in. Next time we cover this team, we're definitely going to deep dive into that and figure out what makes Dan Hughes tick. All right, next team we got coming this week is the Phoenix Mercury. All right, this team, little background on them if you're not aware. They have an all-time great in Diana Taurasi, arguably the GOAT, setting records here and there, and now every shot she makes is probably a new record. They have a player in their prime in Brittany Griner, who's been balling out last year. Her stats are a little bit of a lie last year just because she did have an injury for a while, so her numbers are kind of cushioned from that. But she was playing lights out all season. I have my own issues with her challenging herself and playing to her best of ability because I think sky's the limit. She should be dominating this league. But this team last year basically had them two as the only turn-back players from the year before. Now they have a few more players that have been on the team for a little bit. They added a ton of paint presence this offseason that left a lot of people scratching their heads. Eli, let's start in the shallow end before we get to the deep side. What's your initial take on them? I mean, they were able to make the playoffs. No one expected that to happen. They got past the elimination round. I think a lot of that had to do with playoff experience in their two stars, and then a couple other players just having, pops of games. What do you think about the Phoenix Mercury? And then we'll get deep.
I think they're right on the precipice of being contenders. And I know we got into debate on Twitter with some other WNBA fans and reporters, and that's great. I love the conversation. Agree to disagree, but we just need more dialogue. I'm torn. For me, I left them. I know Ben Dahl of the Summit feels they're a contender alongside Minnesota and LA. To me, I put them in tier 2, and I think I put them with Connecticut and Atlanta. I think because, when you have a force like Griner and Taurasi, and you have a coach like Sandy Brindello, and you've won a championship, and you're bringing back Dupree, this is a team that can easily get right back to that semifinals. Like, they're so savvy, veterans. There's no doubt in my mind they can get to the semifinals, but I still think that they're, a cup below Minnesota and LA. And I think, unfortunately, because they're more of a veteran orientation, I don't see their ceiling as high. You know what I mean? Like, Connecticut is a team that, even though they lost to Phoenix in the playoffs last year, like, they're just going to get better and better because they're young. So I feel like they're a team where maybe Phoenix is a slight notch above Connecticut today, but if we're talking about like who's a bigger threat to LA and Minnesota long term, I'd put Connecticut ahead of them because of their youth and their higher ceiling to improve. So I feel like Phoenix is kind of like a high floor but lower ceiling team, and that we know they're going to be really good and we know that they can compete with anybody in the playoffs, but I just don't think they have the youth and depth and scoring ability on the perimeter to really compete with Minnesota and LA in a 5-game series.
Well, I think it's interesting what you said there. They're a better team today, arguably, than Connecticut. But what I'm looking at is if we're talking end of the season, like that's another season under their belt. We've talked a lot about Connecticut and what they can do, and they're probably going to be featured on next week's podcast because we've argued about that a lot in our own time, so we just got to get it out there on the airwaves. But with the Mercury, I just don't – again, I agree with you on this. Like, their ceiling is a little bit lower. If they're in a one-and-done series, you can't bet against them, even if they're going up against a team like Connecticut, who I would argue is arguably in that top tier with the Lynx and the Sparks. I don't think Mercury – I think the Mercury is the team that's – closest to getting on the level of the Sun, but they don't necessarily have that ceiling because I'm saying to myself, look what Connecticut can do. Connecticut, in my mind, is arguing for the number 2 spot. And you can say, in my book, if you're arguing Lynx or Sparks, you can argue either way, and I won't really disagree with you too hard about who's the number 1 team in a power ranking. And guys, we're going to have our power ranking debate on a separate podcast. There'll be a short little just us debating our power rankings and why we think so coming up probably next week or this weekend. But when I'm talking Phoenix, I don't think they're on the level of Connecticut, because Connecticut, I'm looking at them by the end of the year, obviously barring injuries, they're a better team than the Mercury. In a one-game series, I can't say that like I would bet against them, but I think they're definitely they're a worse team than Connecticut.
I think we're kind of on the same page with that.
Well, that's good to hear. It's better than us ranting for a while on that, because I've already gone for a little bit. But what are your thoughts on their signings in the offseason? I mean, getting Camille Little back, you keep Yvonne Turner, you make a few other moves to get the other Little, LY, and you get Bonner back. Do you think their paint presence? I don't know. Do you think it's like too many cooks?
Well, they're kind of doubling down on being this really good, big team in the paint defensively with both Littles and Griner. And I mean, there are advantages to doing that. It's really hard to score on a team like that, and it's really hard to offensive rebound on a team like that. But I think what we saw against LA is people were able to kind of play off Camille Little, and she had a couple of moments where she hit some shots, but by and large, teams could just play 4-on-5 and completely ignore her. And so I thought they needed to address having a stretch four. So I was a little surprised when they brought in Sancho, not because she's not a good basketball player. She's really good, and maybe in some ways might even take that starting spot. But it felt like next to Griner, they needed somebody who can space the floor and guard on the perimeter, because one problem is like when Brittany Griner has to come out and guard Nneka on the perimeter or come out and guard Candace, then that allows Odyssey Sims and Chelsea Gray to go straight to the rim. And so I thought having a more athletic four who can shoot the ball on offense and then on defense play on the perimeter and allow Brittany Griner to just stay under the rim and alter shots. So I was a little bit surprised they didn't address that.
I mean, do you think that having Bonner back kind of addresses that?
I mean, we'll have to see. Like, what's your take on the context? Because, I mean, it's been a while, and, I mean, isn't she going to more so play the three?
Yeah, I would think, but, she's definitely a player that can get out there, and she has flexibility. So, it's not like she's small. She's 6'4".
She's a very lanky, big, long guard, and she can switch, and I like that. But I think she'll definitely, she's not the four. So I still think
I don't think she's a starting four, but I think that she could be in on the four for a little bit.
My point is starting Camille Little had some liabilities, and I don't think Sancho solves that.
Well, I mean, I think it's kind of interesting that we're talking about Phoenix while we're talking about Seattle, because I think Mercury also lack one of their paint positions, but also when it comes to the guards, there's a lot of question marks. Leilani Mitchell came in last year and really played lights out and made a name for herself when D-Rob was supposed to get in there and really take the role coming in the offseason. They made that big signing. It was supposed to be a big role, a big addition to this team, and she kind of fizzled out and didn't do much for the team and was just horrible offensively, looking at the stats, not to be an ass or anything. What do you think, what's their main focus? All right, this is our biggest weakness. With other teams, it's a little bit more cut and dry. When you have someone who's so good like Brittany Griner, I agree with you. You need to keep her in the paint to use her to her best ability.
I mean, go ahead.
So do they... Yeah, no, go. No, go. What do you
Well, I'm just looking at the roster, right? Like, you probably start Griner at the 5, Bonner at the 3, Taurasi at the 1, and then therein lies the crux of their problems. They don't have a lot of two-way players, right? And we talked about that. They're great defensive players, can be liabilities on offense, and vice versa, right? D-Rob can be a spark plug. He's not a great shooter. Leilani Mitchell is a really good shooter, and I think an underrated defender, but she's 5'5". So there's certain matchups that she's just a liability as far as size, And then, like we've already talked at the 4, both Sancho Little and Camille Little, really don't stretch the floor. And with Griner in there, it creates spacing problems. So that's my issue. They don't have a group of five that really maximize the spacing for their big three of Bonner, Griner, and Taurasi. Now, those three alone are, like I said, those three alone are good enough to get you to the semifinals of this league. But, when you look at the starting five of LA and Minnesota and how well they work together, this roster just has, gaping holes. Hot take.
Well, I'll tell you a hot take. Diana Taurasi, not good on defense anymore. And that's been a huge weakness that this team
some of the time, which I don't blame her, but it's still a problem.
It's a huge problem because the way that their roster is built is they're expecting Brittany Griner to play really well, which is going to happen 95% of the time. And that 5%, another hot take, is when she's going against the top five centers in the league. When she's going up against LA, Minnesota, Tina Charles, even when she's going up against, Washington against EDD. If you look at when she plays against the top tier talent against her in the league, and she doesn't just dominate them and she's really challenged play in and play out, she has struggled. I have been extremely critical of her on this because I'm aware of how high the ceiling is for her. And I don't think she puts in, I don't want to say the effort, but she's not there each play. And other players know how skilled she is, and they know when they're going into these games, okay, I'm going to give it each game. And that starts to get into your psyche and say, I can take it to her each play, and eventually she's going to get pissed off. I think some of that, I don't want to say feeds off of Taurasi, but Taurasi has that attitude also. She takes a couple plays off. I'm going to give it to her. She's arguably the GOAT. She also is lights out and takes so much of the weight on offense because they rely on her so much that she should be able to take plays off. They need the rest of their roster to step up so that their star players can, someone like Taurasi, who's getting up in years and is also on the end of her career, needs to take time off. She retired from overseas because she needs more time off. She needs to be able to heal, and her legs are getting up there. You need other players to step up. Leilani Mitchell can come in and score some points, but if you have Leilani Mitchell and Taurasi, Leilani's going to press the ball and get in your face from the get and try and poke the ball, make some scrappy plays. She's a really scrappy player defensively and offensively. But, is she a solid play in and play out? Because defender, I want your take on that kind of, I know she can make splash plays that kind of ignite the Mercury. Do you think that Leilani Mitchell could be a solid play in and play out player?
I think she's ideally coming off the bench. I think she's an excellent shooter, a good spark plug, but her size has some limitations. And I know I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but I feel like in some ways this draft is after, obviously, Asia Wilson would be the top pick, and then you have DeShields and Williams and Kelsey Mitchell as other prizes. But I feel like after that, Phoenix picks 8th, and I feel like this is kind of becoming the Lexi Brown sweepstakes. I mean, she would just be perfect on this team. She's 5'9", shooting 40% from three at Duke, and is just a bigger guard and someone who can learn from Taurasi as well and be another scorer, and also will allow Taurasi to play the 2. So again, they're another team that really, and I think after 8 it drops a little bit. I think after 8, 9 it drops. But they can make a significant upgrade just through the draft.
Yeah, well, that's my thought, and I think it's interesting to think about who they would draft. Lexi Brown, a lot of teams are going to want her. She could be huge because, what I was thinking about with Leilani or with whoever they're going to play, D-Rob has kind of been a disappointment. Is this the year that she kind of steps up? She was solid defensively. Let's not get that wrong. She was solid defensively. Her inefficiencies were on offense, which really caused them to say, okay, we need to get someone else in there, especially when Taurasi was out with the injury last year. So, getting a guard that then they could push DT to the 2 would be great if that person can be a solid defender and somebody on offense. Because if she can't, then it doesn't really matter. They need someone who has the ability to hold it on both sides.
Exactly. They need two-way players, and that's the thing. D-Rob and Leilani Mitchell can play big roles on this team, but to get them back to that title contending spot, especially with Griner, they need two-way players. I think Lexi Brown can be that. And I think she can play the one or the two, as Taurasi, still has some gas left in the tank, and then that solves some problems. But I think it goes back to the 4 situation though. Like, again, when Sancho or Camille are out there, Griner will be double teamed every time. And we saw what LA did to that, right? When you have Nneka and Candace double teaming her and leaving Camille Little open, and Sancho will be that same problem. So how are they going to fix that? And there's not a lot of stretch 4s in this league, true stretch 4s that can really shoot it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a problem that they're going to need someone to step up into. I mean, do you think offensively Sancho Little did not really have good ratings last year?
I mean, that's why LA is so good. You can't double Nneka or Candace. That's why, it was so important for Brunson to improve her shooting. And you saw when LA did double fouls or put pressure on fouls, Brunson was good enough, not elite, but good enough on offense to step up in the finals and make LA pay for being overly aggressive on fouls. That's going to be Phoenix's biggest problem. When Griner's double teamed and they just have these liabilities out there, not just Little, but even if like a D-Rob's out there, now you can double on from a guard slot, from the weak side. So you got to have two-way players, or else teams can load up on Griner, and especially with Taurasi, not playing as many minutes anymore and resting some games. Now you can really bring the house on Griner.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's what it is. It used to be when Griner was early on, when Griner first came to the team and Taurasi was still lights out. I mean, I'm not trying to knock her or anything. She's not who she used to be, and that happens to all players. She's never going to be the same prime Diana. But when BG first joined this team, you couldn't, having a lights out player, a great player around the rim, and a great lights out player outside of the 3-point line really made it like the teams had to start picking, their poison kind of. And now when, DT isn't at that same top tier level, this team needs to reinvent itself to a certain degree. Do you think that it makes more sense? Do you find somebody in this draft who could be a flex forward? I mean,
I don't see it right now. Again, I have to do more tape. I mean, like Gabby Williams would be ideal, but she's not going to be available for them at 8. Monique Billings is like a nice, power forward center out of UCLA who can score and rebound, but she's not a 3-point shooter. I think she's someone to look at because at least she can score. So maybe like if she's next to Griner, like while she's not a 3-point shooter, at least she's somebody you can't just completely ignore. So I think it's a step in the right direction, but she's not, like a Brianna Stewart who can really step out and knock down the 3, or even a Jonquel Jones who can knock down the 3. But, Billings at 8 is someone to look at because she can score, but to answer, there's not like a clear answer there. Now, let's talk to Sandy. I'd be interested to talk to her on the pod because maybe from their perspective is, listen, there's not a lot of forwards in this league that are lights out 3-point shooters. So we're just going to have a strategy of like, we're going to be impossible to score on in the paint, right? You're going to have to get through Little and Griner, and that's just going to be really hard. And we're going to make teams have to, shoot mid-range and floaters and all types of other shots. And they don't give up a lot of threes because they have D-Rob and Mitchell who can really pressure the ball.
Yeah, I mean, look, without looking at when you take a deeper dive into this team, I start to be more hesitant about my criticalness earlier on in the podcast, and kind of when someone asked me about the Phoenix Mercury, my initial response is what I said in the beginning, which is they're not on the same level as Connecticut at the end of next season. Or at the end of this season, so I don't consider them a contender. I think it's between the top 3 teams, and arguably Atlanta's higher up than Mercury in my mind. But when you look at them and you start thinking about how this team could operate, how this team could work, and they have a firecracker off the bench who can be really pesty and get a few good shots, get the ball a little bit, this team starts to make me question my opinion. And I think that's something good going into the season, especially generally they're under the radar. They have their name. They're one of the few teams besides the Lynx they're one of the few teams to win a championship in the past, 7 years besides the Lynx. So there's a lot to be said about that. The team did lose Monique Curry, who I thought was a really solid stopgap during the injury to DT. I really think it goes back to how they want to play it. Do you think? I think they're probably going to end up, based off their offseason moves, going for a guard in the draft.
Yeah, Curry. I mean, I don't think the Curry loss is huge, just given the return of Bonner and the fact that they can add a guard in this draft that can contribute right away. And I think, in the playoffs, you need to be a little bit more versatile and athletic. And having Taurasi and Curry, it's tough. I think our biggest takeaway with this roster is just they have a lot of good defensive players that are offensive liabilities, and it just kind of limits their ability to play a lot of them together. And they don't have a lot of combos that can match up with the elite of this league.
Yeah, I mean, the team is definitely, or not the team, the league and how teams have started to form has definitely shifted in a way that I think is going away from how this Mercury team plays. But I also think there's a lot to be said. Brunell is a great coach. You have some great talent on the team, and they could definitely be scary when you look at who's coming off the bench. I mean, if I'm thinking right now, who's going to be my starter? If you're talking about starting five, obviously BG at the five. Then one of the littles at the four. I assume that they're going to stick with Camille. Maybe they'll move on over to Sancho. Robinson's going to be in there on the starting. Shea Murphy's probably going to start getting some more minutes. I'd like to see that. I think she has an opportunity. She didn't get a lot of time last year. She only had 28 possessions, but let her get out there. Let her get some chances. There's a lot of positive for her. I think this team has a lot of question marks as far as who they're going to start, because Bonner's going to get out there also. So, I mean, right there, that's your starting five, right?
Look, Griner's getting better at passing out of double teams. Bonner shot 33% in 2016 from three. Her career's at 30. She's not a lights-out three-point shooter, but she can knock it down if you leave her open. And I think that's something she should, if she can give them 33, 34%, Taurasi's a phenomenal shooter. Leilani Mitchell's a phenomenal shooter. They add someone like Lexi Brown as a phenomenal shooter. Then I think that's, kind of enough shooting around Griner. But again, they're going to have to figure out something with Camille Little and Sancho Little. And I think Coach Brondello saw that and realizes, and she's a good coach. And I think there are things you can do when Griner's double teamed to, really put pressure on the basket. Make sure those players are by the basket. So if you double off them, you're giving up a layup. There are some more things that can be done. But I think that's kind of a theme we'll see going forward, and kind of they'll need to solve that if they want to push into the title conversation.
Yeah, I think they definitely need to solve that if they want to push into the title conversation. I think they also need to kind of, well, all right, I just want to get this out there because people probably are sitting there thinking, oh, Aria hates BG. She doesn't give her enough respect. She's an excellent player, and I don't think she's done growing and done getting better. I think this year, it's kind of, they trusted her a lot more early on than what we saw in Seattle going on with Stewie, because Diana Taurasi was still at a top tier, and the Mercury basically put even playing field for both of them from the beginning. And obviously, I think BG, just because her size and her natural talent was a little bit different style, obviously a different style, but a different level where she could just come in there and be a dominant force in this league no matter what. And the real question is who's going to step up and continue to fill the role as Diana Taurasi takes a smaller and smaller role on this team? Who's going to be the person to hit a big shot for three? You can rely on DT to make a couple of those during the season, But this isn't, 4 years ago. This isn't when they won the championship. You can't expect her to just be the dagger that, I know as a Lynx fan, I hated Diana Taurasi because she made so many of those clutch shots that you knew that was the end of the game, or you knew that was the signal to the end of the game. And she was that type of person to so many fans of so many teams that you just hated her. Because every time you knew it, they were down by 2. Diana Taurasi got the ball, and she starts driving to the paint. And somehow, you'd blink your eyes, she'd be shooting a 3 and win the game.
That's why I think, getting Lexi Brown, a guard like that, or even Jordan Canada, UCLA, they need that next playmaker. They need someone who's going to make plays. It's a guard. At the end of the day, basketball, yes, the WNBA is a centers league, but the guards have to bring the ball up. Guards have the balls in their hand. And Bonner and Taurasi, there's only so much left you can rely on. They need a young guard of the future. They've got to get younger and more versatile. And I think Lexi Brown is just perfect for that role. But, I think for right now, they're still in a title window, and they're just going to double down on their interior defense and really hope that keeps them in games. And I think it definitely does. We even though the Sparks swept them, we definitely saw they were able to slow them down. It's just it's hard to get on the rim. But what LA was able to do ultimately was drag Griner out of the paint, and then they'd attack.
Yeah. I just think this is such an interesting team because they can really decide to go in different paths. I'm looking at, this is the part of time where we do fan questions. I got one here from Bobby24 Mercer on Twitter. I guess he's an MC and avid sports fan. And he wants to know who's going to be the new person on the team. I think what he's implying based off this is, I'm just trying to decipher based off the tweet. It's a little bit hard to understand, but who's going to be the new DT? Who's going to be the one to make things happen? And then we kind of touched on that just now. So they need a new guard. And I think we have to look to the draft if we're this team. And I think the reason you have to look to the draft is this team look at the roster right now. They have a couple of young people on them, but for the most part, they're a vet savvy team. Now that's one of their positives. And we talked about that earlier. That's one of their strengths. But you need to bring some youth to rejuvenate them. And I think a powerful guard, somebody who maybe could flow into playing a 4, somebody who has a similar body type to Bonner, tall, lanky, and can stretch around.
Yeah, it's going to have to come through the draft. I already said who I like. I think we already answered that. But they have the 8th pick. I think there are 4 guards that not necessarily all of them will be great, but 4 guards that have that kind of starter to all-star potential, right? Diamond DeShields, Kelsey Mitchell, Jordan Canada, and Lexi Brown. And I think picking 8th is no guarantee, but I think they have a good shot at getting one of those.
Yeah, and I think in this draft, the first round is going to be players for each team if picked right, because obviously someone could fuck it up. If picked right, that could be a game changer for that team. Folks, that's all we got now for this week's edition of WNBA Insider Podcast. Again, I'm Aryeh Schwartz along with Eli Horowitz. This was another week of a deep dive into each WNBA team. Join us next week while we're going to break down 2 more individual teams. Follow us on Twitter at WNBAinsidr.com. And Eli, what's your Twitter handle
Coach
again?
Horowitz 13. That's HOROWITZ.
And guys, don't forget, we're on iTunes. Probably if you're listening on this, or for Android, you can download it on the website. It's WNBAinsidr.com. Have a great night and send us your questions. We want to hear from you.